It was a clear August morning in Brookhaven, North Carolina, the kind where the air felt warm but not yet suffocating, and the cicadas were just starting their steady hum. Dr. Maren Ellis, a 54-year-old epidemiologist, sat at her oak desk, sorting through virus simulation models for a lecture she was scheduled to give at Carolina State University. The glow of her laptop lit her glasses, and the quiet tapping of keys was the only sound in the room. Numbers, probabilities, infection curves. This was her world. Science had been her anchor since she was a teenager. She believed in what could be measured, tested, proven. Faith, miracles, those were for other people. Then it happened. No warning, no gradual ache, just a sharp, crushing pain that seized her chest as if a steel vice had locked around her heart. The mug of coffee on her desk tipped, spilling across her notes, but she barely noticed. The pain stole her breath before she could cry out. Her vision tunneled, colors fading into gray, and a high ringing filled her ears like a fire alarm. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled, sending her crashing to the carpet. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a neighbor pounding on the door, but it felt miles away. In the emergency room of Brookhaven General Hospital, the fluorescent lights glared cold and merciless. The medical team's voices blurred into urgent commands, BP dropping. Clear the airway, charging, clear. Dr. Ellis felt none of it the way a patient should. Instead, she was watching from a strange distance, as though the body on the gurney was no longer her own. The steady beeping of the heart monitor flatlined into one long, unwavering tone. She heard someone, maybe a nurse, say the words that should have ended her story. We've lost her. But it didn't end. Instead of sinking into darkness, she felt a gentle release, as if every burden she had carried, deadlines, responsibilities, unspoken grief, was suddenly lifted. There was a warmth, subtle at first, then wrapping around her like a wool blanket on a winter night. Ahead of her, a soft light spiraled into the distance. It wasn't blinding, it invited her. And beneath it all, there was a sound, low and steady, like the heartbeat of the universe itself. In that moment, for the first time in her life, Dr. Maren Ellis stopped thinking in numbers and equations. She wasn't calculating probabilities. She wasn't observing. She was simply being. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the skepticism she had worn like armor begin to crack. This was no dream. It was too vivid, too full of texture. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth. The light seemed to hum. And with every step, if you could call it a step, she felt lighter, more alive. Just as she began to wonder where this path would lead, a figure appeared at the center of the light, radiant yet human in form. And in her heart, without any introduction, she knew exactly who it was. Her breath caught, not out of fear, but out of awe. She had studied the human body all her life, but nothing had prepared her for the presence standing before her. And then, just as her mind began to form a question, the figure raised a hand. The hand in the light did not move quickly, nor did it need to. It was steady, calm, and sure, a gesture that carried both welcome and command. As the glow softened, she saw his face. It was unlike any face she had ever known, yet it felt as familiar as her own reflection. His eyes were deep, not merely in color but in a way that drew her in, as though they could see every moment of her life, the long hours in the lab, the sleepless nights worrying over data, the silent grief she carried since her mother's passing. And in those eyes, she saw no judgment, only compassion. Dr. Maren Ellis had read about people meeting Jesus in near-death experiences, often dismissing them as the brain's last flicker before shutting down. But this was different. She could feel the temperature in the air, warmer near him, almost like the quiet heat that radiates from a fireplace on a winter evening. She could smell something faint, not antiseptic, not the metallic tang of a hospital, but something sweet, almost like blooming honeysuckle in spring. Her heart no longer pounded with fear. Instead, it kept time with a rhythm that felt older than the world itself. He didn't speak with his mouth, yet his words reached her with a clarity that no human voice could match. Maren, you've crossed the threshold, but you are being given a chance, a mission. The moment the words formed in her mind, he placed his hand gently on her forehead. A warmth surged through her, not burning but flowing, like sunlight filtering through water. Every cell, every thought lit up with a quiet energy. It felt like remembering something she had always known but had forgotten. The vision shifted before she could speak. She saw the name Umbra 25, U25 for short, etched in her mind as if written by light itself. Images flashed. Fog curling over a forest. The steel cages of a forgotten laboratory. The restless movement of small animals in the shadows. She didn't need a microscope to know this was a virus unlike any she had studied. It was patient, silent, almost deliberate. Then came the words again. White smoke will rise over the nations. The phrase echoed like a bell tolling in the distance. She didn't fully understand it, but she felt its weight. It was not just about illness, it was about confusion, fear, and the way people would turn away from each other when they needed each other most. Marin wanted to ask, when, where, how can I stop it? But before she could, Jesus's gaze held hers, and she felt the answer was larger than a list of instructions. It was a call, not just to warn, but to prepare hearts, to remind the world that strength without compassion is hollow. Her chest ached, not from pain, but from the overwhelming mixture of urgency and tenderness in his presence. And then, without warning, the light around them began to bend and swirl. She felt herself being pulled, not away from him, but deeper into the vision. The warmth on her forehead faded, replaced by the damp chill of a place she had never been, a forest lab hidden from the world. The warmth of his presence gave way to a damp chill that clung to her skin like fog on an early winter morning. Dr. Marin Ellis found herself standing, though she wasn't sure she still had feet, in the middle of a dense forest. Towering pines loomed overhead, their branches heavy with moss, filtering the gray light into uneven patches. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something metallic, as though rain had fallen on rust. Ahead, half hidden by tangled undergrowth, stood a weathered building. Its concrete walls were streaked with mildew, and one corner sagged under the weight of years. Faded hazard signs clung to its doors, their symbols barely visible. She could hear the faint rattle of metal from within cages. Perhaps the sound was irregular, like something moving slowly, deliberately. She stepped closer, and the temperature seemed to drop further. The scent of animal musk mixed with disinfectant drifted out, a smell she knew well from years in epidemiology. Yet here it carried an edge, a wrongness. Inside, her vision adjusted to the dim light. Rows of steel cages lined the walls, each holding small creatures, bats with twitching wings, rodents darting in restless circles. Their eyes caught the faint light and reflected it back like pinpricks of fire. It wasn't just the animals. The air itself felt heavy, as if saturated with something unseen. Marin's instincts, the same ones honed by decades of studying pathogens, screamed that this place was wrong. Dangerous. She reached for a clipboard on a nearby desk. The paper was damp, ink bleeding into unreadable shapes. But she caught fragments. Strain viability. Aerosol transmission. U25 active. She dropped the clipboard, heart tightening. The term, active, in this context was no abstraction. It meant the virus was alive. Present, ready to move. She turned, half expecting to see researchers in white coats. But the facility was deserted. Dust floated through beams of weak light, disturbed only by the shifting of the caged animals. Yet she felt it. Something else in the room. Not a person, but a presence, like a whisper pressed against her skin. Marin wanted to leave, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her scientific mind fought to catalog what she was seeing. A high-containment lab without containment. Animals carrying unknown pathogens, records pointing to airborne spread. But another part of her, the part that had felt Jesus's touch, knew this was more than a professional hazard. This was the seedbed of a storm. Then the sound came, faint at first, then rising, a low, rhythmic thump, like the pulse of a machine or the slow beating of a giant heart. It came from deeper within the building. Against her will, she followed it down a narrow corridor, the air growing colder, the light dimmer, until she reached a steel door left ajar. She pushed it open. What she saw inside made her forget to breathe. A single large enclosure. empty of animals, but the air inside shimmered as though alive. She couldn't see it, but she knew. This was Umbra 25's true home. The shimmer in the empty enclosure seemed to pulse once, twice, and then the scene dissolved around her like mist in sunlight. Dr. Marin Ellis blinked, and when her vision cleared, she was no longer in the forest lab. She stood in the middle of a bustling open-air seafood market in the coastal city of Harborside, Maryland. The air was thick with scents, briny saltwater from freshly caught crabs, the pungent tang of oysters, and the smoky spice of Old Bay seasoning clinging to the stalls. Vendors shouted prices over the din, $3 a pound, fresh off the boat, while customers haggled, their laughter and frustration mixing in the humid air. Wooden crates clattered as fishmongers flipped open lids, releasing plumes of cold vapor that curled into the crowd. It was ordinary life at its most alive. And yet, beneath the color and motion, something felt wrong. Marin scanned the crowd. A young man coughed into his sleeve before shaking hands with a friend. An elderly woman dabbed her nose with a tissue, then picked through shrimp with bare fingers. A child sneezed, droplets catching the light for just a heartbeat before vanishing. No one seemed concerned. No one noticed, but Marin felt it, the unseen threads weaving through the air, connecting strangers in ways they didn't understand. She recognized the early signs, vague symptoms, small clusters of illness in rural clinics. Nothing yet that would alarm the public. This was the danger she had seen in the lab's still air. The quiet moment before the world realizes it is already exposed. The white smoke here was not from cremations or fire, it was ignorance itself, drifting lazily over the heads of people who believed life was still normal. Her mind flickered back to the winter of 2020, when she had watched colleagues dismiss the first reports out of distant provinces. Seasonal flu, they said then, and it was months before the world understood the cost of those words. She felt the same weight pressing on her now, the knowledge that by the time the truth is clear, it is already too late to contain it. A fish vendor wiped sweat from his brow, picked up a fillet with ungloved hands, and handed it to the next customer. Marin's stomach twisted, not because of poor hygiene alone, but because she could almost see the invisible cloud of risk hovering between them. It was like watching a spark fall into dry grass, knowing the fire would come, even if no one else could smell the smoke. She wanted to shout a warning, to tell them to stop, to wash their hands, to go home, but her voice stayed locked in her chest. This was only a vision, and she was only a witness. The market moved on around her, oblivious, as if the future she saw was a secret written in a language no one else could read. Then, like a camera snapping to a new scene, the noise of the market cut out, replaced by the deep, echoing wail of sirens. The crowd vanished. Marin stood alone in an empty city street, and somewhere in the distance, smoke was already rising. The sirens grew louder, wrapping around her like a cold wind. Dr. Marin Ellis turned her head and found herself no longer in Harborside. She was now standing in the heart of Eastborough, a city that once pulsed with neon lights and restless traffic. But the lights blinked to no rhythm now, and the streets, wide enough for 6 lanes of cars, lay completely bare. A single piece of paper skittered across the asphalt, the sound sharp in the silence. She walked down Main Avenue, where cafes and bookstores once spilled chatter and music into the air. Now, the windows were dark, chairs sat overturned inside, as if someone had left in a hurry. The only movement came from a lone traffic light swaying in the wind, its green glow useless without cars to command. The absence of life was heavier than any noise. Then came the low hum of engines. Marin turned a corner and froze. Parked bumper to bumper along the street were refrigerated trucks, dozens of them. Their white metal sides gleamed under the weak daylight, but their purpose was unmistakable. Mobile morgues. She didn't have to open them to know they were full. Her vision shifted again, and she was in West Bay, a city by the Pacific known for its palm-lined boulevards and glittering nightlife. But the palm fronds hung limp, and the Walk of Fame lay cracked, littered with scraps of paper and plastic bags rolling like tumbleweeds. The freeway above was frozen, not by traffic, but by lines of abandoned vehicles, their doors hanging open, sirens still flashing without drivers. The air was thick with the scent of burning, not the comforting smoke of a campfire, but the acrid bite of buildings and belongings set aflame. Somewhere nearby, a store had been looted, its windows shattered, glass crunching under Marin's shoes as she stepped over the threshold. Shelves lay overturned, goods scattered, and the silence inside was deafening. And then, the sound returned, sirens. Dozens of them, echoing through empty canyons of skyscrapers. They weren't moving quickly, they wailed in place, their sound bouncing back on itself until it felt like the city was crying. Marin could almost feel the vibration in her chest, steady and mournful. She thought of her first year as a young doctor, when the was overrun with flu patients during a bad winter. Even then, the chaos had felt alive, full of people fighting to live. This was different. This was absence. The city was a giant, powerful once, but now lying still, breathless, waiting for something that would not come. And just as the weight of that stillness began to crush her, the horizon changed. In the far distance, beyond the empty towers, columns of white smoke began to rise, twisting skyward like silent messengers. The white smoke on the horizon swirled and then thinned, pulling her into the next scene. The skyline vanished, replaced by open fields under a pale, restless sky. Dr. Marin Ellis recognized the rural South instantly. Long stretches of two-lane highway, weathered barns, and the faint smell of diesel drifting from distant farm equipment. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. The quiet here was different, taut, like a rope pulled too tight. Along the road, she saw them. Waves of people walking away from the cities. Their clothes dusty, their faces drawn. Some pushed shopping carts with squeaky wheels. Others carried duffel bags slung over tired shoulders. A father dragged a plastic wagon where two small children sat wrapped in blankets. Their eyes scanned the fields, not in wonder, but in hunger. At first, she thought they were seeking safety, that the countryside would welcome them. But just ahead, at the entrance to a small town, a barricade stretched across the road. Plywood sheets, rusted farm gates, and old pickup trucks blocked the way. Spray painted in red across a wooden board were the words, "Keep out." Behind the barricade, men and women in hunting jackets gripped rifles, their expressions as fixed as the gun barrels. Marin stepped closer, unseen by them, and listened. There was no shouting, no negotiation. Just the sound of wind moving through the dry grass and the faint click of someone loading a rifle. She turned to look at the people on the other side of the barricade. They weren't an invading force, they were exhausted families. But here, desperation was met with suspicion. The vision pulled her further, past the barricade into the heart of the countryside. She saw farms left untended, corn stalks browning in the fields, grain silos pried open and empty. In the distance, a barn lay blackened by fire, its skeletal beams jutting toward the sky. Along the roadside, clusters of makeshift tents sagged under the weight of damp canvas, smoke curling from barrels where scraps of wood burned low. Children's cries cut through the air, thin and tired. Mothers whispered promises of food they didn't have. Men paced near the edge of campfires, clutching whatever tools or weapons they could find. Hunger was everywhere, not just in empty stomachs but in the wary way people glanced at each other, as if the next loaf of bread might cost more than they could pay. This was not the kindness she remembered from her own childhood in a small Carolina town, where neighbors shared casseroles and tools without keeping score. This was a colder countryside, one where fences were higher, locks thicker, and welcome mats pulled inside. The white smoke here was no longer just ignorance, it was the smoke of burned trust, rising from the ashes of community. And just as the ache of it settled in her chest, the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the fields, she heard the low rumble of engines, not farm tractors, but convoys, the kind that came with orders and authority. The low rumble grew louder until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Dr. Marin Ellis found herself standing on an overpass, watching a convoy of military vehicles snake down the interstate. Armored trucks, Humvees, and fuel tankers moved in grim formation. Their engines roared, but the soldiers inside were silent, faces hidden behind visors. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was containment. The vision pulled her further north, and suddenly she was in the capital, not Raleigh, not even Washington, but the capital district of the nation itself. Government buildings loomed, their flags at half-mast. Inside, she saw long conference tables covered in papers and half-empty coffee cups. Men and women in suits argued, their voices sharp and overlapping. Charts on the walls showed infection curves climbing steeply. Arrows in red. Every plan discussed seemed to crumble before it was finished. From there, she was pulled across the country, into the vast halls of airports that had once been gateways to the world. At North Point International, rows of jet bridges stood empty, their glass tunnels reflecting only the overcast sky. Departure boards flickered with a single word, "Cancelled." Families sat slumped on the floor, their luggage unopened. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and abandoned food trays. The ports were worse. In Gulfview Harbor, cargo ships sat anchored offshore, stacked high with containers that would never be unloaded. Towering cranes stood frozen mid-air, their skeletal arms silhouetted against a sunless sky. The scent of saltwater mixed with the acrid tang of rusting metal. Without movement, the harbor felt less like an economic engine and more like a graveyard for industry. Borders closed, alliances unraveled. Marin saw embassies shuttered, their flags lowered, streets outside lined with abandoned cars. On the news screens in hotel lobbies, leaders addressed their nations, voices measured but eyes betraying fatigue. Words like temporary measures and controlled response rolled across the ticker. But the faces watching from couches and bar stools looked unconvinced. She remembered her days teaching at Carolina State, explaining how interconnected the modern world was, how a disruption in one system could ripple across others. Now she was seeing it in real time. Medicine failing as supply chains collapsed. Commerce grinding to a halt because ports and airports were silent. Governments faltering under the weight of too many crises at once. And through it all, the white smoke persisted, not just from fires or cremations, but from the slow burning of entire structures. Political and economic, it was the exhaust of a machine breaking apart. The haze that rose when a world built on speed and certainty suddenly hit a wall. Just when she thought the vision had shown her the worst, she saw something stranger. Maps of the world. Their borders shifting. Entire nations shaded differently, as if the rules themselves were being rewritten. The maps faded, but their shifting borders left a hollow ache in her chest. Dr. Marin Ellis felt the vision pressing closer now, as if it were no longer just a series of scenes but a weight she was being asked to carry. The air around her thickened, dimming into a muted gray, and in the haze she began to hear it, not the roar of engines or the wail of sirens, but a softer, more dangerous sound. People weeping. The sound pulled her into a dim hospital corridor. The walls were scuffed, the overhead lights flickering as if unsure they could hold on. Stretchers lined the hallway, each occupied by someone struggling to breathe. Nurses moved from one patient to another, their eyes tired above their masks, their hands trembling slightly despite the layers of gloves. The air smelled of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered something sour, the scent of exhaustion. Marin's gaze fell on a young woman sitting on the floor beside a stretcher, clutching an elderly man's hand. The woman's lips moved in prayer, but her voice broke every few words. Marin felt her own knees weaken. This scene was too close, too real. It reminded her of another hospital room years ago, her father's. The beeping monitors, the tight grip of his hand before it went slack, the smell of flowers in the hallway that somehow made the loss sharper. She wanted to turn away, to force the vision to end, but it tightened its hold. Now she saw empty classrooms, their desks pushed into corners. She saw churches with their doors bolted shut, pews gathering dust. She saw grocery stores with half-lit aisles, shelves stripped bare except for the stray dented can no one wanted. Each image chipped away at the fragile hope she'd been trying to hold. And then she heard his voice again, not loud, not forceful, but steady and sorrowful. This is the lesson in pride's fragility. The words sank into her like a stone into deep water. She realized she wasn't just watching the collapse of systems. She was witnessing the breaking of hearts. the stripping away of illusions that people thought would keep them safe. Her chest felt tight, not with illness but with the weight of what she was being asked to carry back. For the first time in the vision, she wondered if she could do it. She was a scientist, trained to work with data and evidence, not visions and prophecy. But here, stripped of all her tools, she understood that what she was being shown wasn't meant for her alone. And just as that thought settled, the gray around her began to thin, replaced by faint streaks of green and gold. Somewhere ahead, life was trying to push through the cracks, and the vision was about to show her how. The green and gold deepened until the gray was gone, replaced by the warm light of late afternoon. Dr. Marin Ellis found herself standing on a hillside overlooking a small valley. Below, people moved slowly between rows of fresh soil, their hands busy planting seeds. The air smelled of turned earth and wildflowers, carrying the faint hum of bees. It was the first time in the vision that the silence felt gentle rather than heavy. Children knelt beside their parents, pressing kernels into the soil and covering them with careful pats. A woman poured water from a dented tin can, her smile faint but real. Nearby, a young man repaired a broken wheelbarrow with a strip of metal and an old leather belt. Everything here was worn, but nothing was abandoned. Marin's chest eased for the first time in hours. She stepped forward, unseen yet feeling as if she were part of the work. The scent of wood smoke rose from a communal fire where a pot simmered, sending up steam fragrant with herbs. People gathered around it not in lines of desperation, but in small groups, trading quiet words and sharing bread from baskets. In the corner of the valley stood a simple wooden building, its roof patched with tin. Inside, Marin saw shelves lined with jars of seeds, each labeled carefully in neat handwriting. At a long table, a group of older men and women sorted beans, their fingers moving with the precision of habit. She recognized the posture, the quiet diligence of those who had lived through hard seasons before and knew how to start again. She thought of her grandmother's garden back in Carolina, the rows of tomatoes and okra, the way the old woman would hum hymns while pulling weeds. It had seemed so ordinary then, but now it felt like a map to survival, a reminder that even the smallest acts could stitch a community back together. Beyond the gardens, Marin saw another kind of rebuilding. People were repairing a small schoolhouse, lifting beams into place while others painted the walls a soft cream color. Laughter broke out when a bucket of paint tipped over, splattering shoes and pants. It was a fragile joy, but joy nonetheless, the kind that grows from doing something together that matters. She understood now why the vision had shown her so much ruin before this. Renewal wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow turning of soil, a patient planting, a trust that something unseen would one day break through the surface. And it wasn't the work of governments or systems, but of hands and hearts in the dirt. But just as hope began to steady her, she noticed the sky darkening at the edges. The gold light was fading, and with it came the distant echo of a sound she had hoped not to hear again, the long, low wail of sirens. The sirens grew louder, curling through the valley like a rising wind. Dr. Marin Ellis turned toward the sound, and the green and gold light of the gardens dimmed to gray once more. The people in the valley froze, their hands pausing mid-task, eyes scanning the hills. From beyond the ridge came the faint shimmer of red and blue lights, flickering against the darkening sky. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The gardens, the schoolhouse, the valley, all of it slid away like a painting peeling from the wall. She stood once again on high ground, but this time she overlooked not one valley, but the whole earth. Cities and countrysides, mountains and coasts, all stretched out below her as if she were seeing them from the edge of the atmosphere. Across that vast view, Marin saw the white smoke she had been following since the beginning. It wasn't confined to one place now, it curled from every continent, blurring coastlines, swallowing borders. In some places it was thin and wispy, in others it boiled up in thick plumes, and beneath it, she could see movements, waves of people, some running toward the smoke, others fleeing from it. The voice came again, steady, unhurried, yet carrying a gravity that silenced every other sound. 5 nations will fall at once. The map will be redrawn overnight. When it happens, there will be no time for debate, only for decision. Marin's pulse quickened. She wanted to ask which nations, to demand a timeline, but the vision didn't work that way. Instead, scenes began to flash. A bustling coastal city swallowed by water. A desert capital consumed by fire. A frozen northern port where ships lay trapped in ice. A sprawling farmland split by violent storms. A highland nation trembling under relentless earthquakes. The voice continued. This is not given so you may fear. It is given so you may prepare, in spirit, in truth, in love. The strongest fortresses will be those built on mercy. The deepest wells will be those filled with faith. The white smoke began to thin, and she saw glimpses of both ruin and restoration. Cities rebuilt with new hands. Strangers breaking bread together. Fields once barren now green again. But the message was clear. The choice would not be made for them. Every person, every community, would have to decide what to hold onto when the shaking came. Then the vision contracted, pulling her back through every scene she had witnessed, the barricades, the empty airports, the gardens, the maps, until she was once again in the quiet hospital room where it had all begun. The monitors hummed, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and her own breath came fast and uneven. Her eyes opened. The vision was gone, but the weight of it remained. She knew she could not keep it to herself. Whatever the cost, the warning had to be spoken. And as she lay back against the pillow, she whispered into the sterile air, not sure if she was speaking to God or to her own heart, I will.